All right, so let's do something that no one ever really talks about when they're doing any type of course or tutorial on a wavetable synth, and that's talk about basic waveforms of synthesis, which this is kind of an interesting topic to me because a wavetable is basically just a hodgepodge, a stew, a soup of different types of waveforms that are put together, and those waveforms come from the basic waveforms, and sometimes there's multiples or there's added dips, added little sections of it, but that's in a nutshell, in a very layman's term, how you can kind of think of wavetables. And we're gonna spend the next video talking about wavetables, just so we get all on the same page with some technical terms and what they are and what they aren't. But basic foundational elements of virtual analog synthesis for software synthesis comes from obviously hardware synths. Think like the Moog and the actual original synths of yesteryear. Now, if you load up one of these synths, and the most classic example of this for software synthesis is probably Sylenth at this point. All right, so here is Sylenth. Now, the really interesting thing about Sylenth to me is it's been around for close to a decade, and it probably has more sound sets, more presets, more sound banks made for it than any other synth in existence, and it's still used today. Now, the reason I say it's interesting is because it only comes with 7 or 8 waveforms. You have a sine wave, you have a saw wave, a triangle wave, pulse, half pulse, quarter pulse, tri-saw, which is a triangle and a saw, and then noise. Those are the basic waveforms of synthesis for the most part. So you get 7 that you can create actual tones with, and then the noise. What's crazy is you only have one type of noise, right? It's not like a synth like Serum or Massive where you have all these other noises, yet people are still able to create really unique sounds. The reason I'm making this point is in Serum, some people always try to find and do crazy things to wavetables. And my point is you don't have to. Just because that feature is there and because you get to do more to the actual source sound that's being generated on an oscillator level in a wavetable synth doesn't mean you always have to. So that's kind of like one of the main points here. There's probably like 10, I guess, unique running themes in this tutorial course. This is one of them. Just because you can throw on like 50 different modulations onto an oscillator in Serum, use a few different warp modes, do some crazy things with the oscillators, doesn't mean you have to get a unique sound. Sometimes less is more with wavetables. Actually, oftentimes it is. All right, so here's Serum again. Now, it may seem real basic, but if I say to you, saw wave, do you know exactly what it sounds like in your head? Can you accurately be like, okay, here's saw, does it sound like this? Right? And if I say sine, do you think of this type of tone? Okay? And if we keep going through some of these, if I say triangle, do you know what a triangle sounds like? Okay, we'll keep going. Square, most of us will know what a square sounds like, I feel like. What about one of the pulses, like an H pulse or a Q pulse? About a triangle saw. Okay, so you need to know and have memorized what those not only sound like, but what type of sounds those are good for creating different things like basses and leads and pads. And then what types of basses, what types of leads, what types of pads. So for instance, let's start with a sine. Sine waves are very pure. They don't have buzzes. They don't have a bunch of harmonics above and below the fundamental frequency like a saw wave does. Right? So these are great for basses. That's why a lot of sub oscillators and synths are literally just a sine wave. Right? They're also very clean and they take to filtering very, very easily. You can add, if you're doing anything FM based in the oscillator, and this is an oscillator level function, you're going to want to mess around with having a sine wave in there because it's easier to control the unpredictable nature of the warp mode, the FM warp mode in Serum. And we're going to talk about all these warp modes throughout this course for sure. That's going to be a big part of it. But you need to be able to know, like, okay, I'm trying to create like a big punchy bass. How do I do it? Well, let's actually just dive into that real quick right now. I want it to have a little bit of high end. So let's run filter A, or oscillator A into a filter. Let's pitch it down. Okay, let's add some voices of unison. Okay, let's make it monophonic. Turn this up so I can hear it better. Okay, let's go to oscillator B now. And we're going to go to the analog shapes, basic shapes, and let's make sure it's on sine. Do you hear how much punchier it is just right now? Off. Okay, I'm not even running that into the filter. Let's run it into the filter. Okay, let's turn off oscillator B. Do you hear that difference? Now, let's just make it oscillator A. Now, it's such a boring tone, you wouldn't really be able to hear that cut through a mix, right? So I know that. I know if I'm trying to create some sort of bass that needs to have a sub or very low element, I'm going to go for something that has a sine wave element to it or just a basic sine wave. Now, this is where it gets interesting with wavetables, is blending an actual wavetable with a basic waveform. So when you're running Serum like this and you're just using a single cycle wavetable, it's essentially like using in Sylenth just an actual waveform, right? Because it's just a continuous waveform. You can't move through the wavetable position if it's just one, okay? So if we go to the wavetable editor here, and let me start deleting some of these. We go to edit undo because that's not what I wanted to do. So we'll just click on this one and we'll just start hitting minus. Okay, so now we go back to this. This is just a single cycle wavetable, which in essence is a waveform, right? This is just a sine waveform, nothing more, nothing less. Okay, so blending basic waveforms or single cycle wavetables or not moving through wavetables can have a really nice impact on the sound. That's kind of going back to that less is more. So let's go back to this idea of knowing and really getting what's going on with these different shapes, these basic shapes. I talked about in the first video how a wavetable is basically an extension of a waveform. It's a more complicated, complex extension of a waveform. Well, if you start going through complex waveforms, and this falls into that, well, how do I know what wavetable to use when? Let's load up some of my custom wavetables here. So here's one that says basic. Now this is basically, if I asked you, well, what's this going to sound like? I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about this. What is this going to sound like? More like a sine? More like a saw? More like a square? What's it going to sound like? All right, let me turn off the filter and we're going to play it. Let's see if you guys could guess. Right? It doesn't sound really a hell of a lot like either. It doesn't sound sinusoidal, right? It's too buzzy. It doesn't sound like a square. It doesn't sound like a... So that's what's interesting about wavetable synths, and more specifically Serum, is that I created this from scratch, okay? In the wavetable editor, drew it in. Now, if I go to the wavetable editor and I do something like this, right now sounds more like a saw wave, correct? Ooh, now it sounds a lot like a saw. Right? Now that's something that you just cannot do in a synth like Sylenth, or almost any synth really. You can just go in and create different waveforms. So that's what's really special about Serum. But to know, to actually get the results that you want, you have to know how it's gonna come out on the other end. Let's go to another wavetable. Okay, this one. What do you think it's gonna sound like? Let's play it. It's kind of like a buzzy sine wave, right? Now, the reason why all this is helpful is if you do load up a wavetable that has more than one cycle or frame, it becomes really helpful to be like, okay, well, I'm trying to make this sound, and it needs to sound a little bit like a square, a little bit like a saw, a little bit like whatever, right? You have to be able to be like, well, hot damn, what is this going to sound like? Otherwise, it's always just guess and check. So once you get real comfortable with that, you'll start to notice patterns that even though it looks like a weird, crazy, complex wave, it'll typically sound like this. And there's only so many shapes in these wavetables that you can actually ever get for the most part. Like you're not going to get some crazy, crazy weird shape you've never seen once you spend a couple hours going through these. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next video where we'll be talking about wavetables.